Oh, hey! Welcome to Flynndogg Woodwork. So today I'm going to try and tackle a project that I've been putting off for a long time. And that's because I've been intimidated by this project and I'm not quite sure where to begin. But we're going to try to go through this project together and see if we can figure it out. So the reason I'm so intimidated by this build is because this project's going to be in my kitchen. And I also want to incorporate a couple of high-tech features into this build that I've never done before. So one of the first things that I'm intimidated by is all our cabinets are made out of cherry. And these have been here a while, so they've darkened up quite a bit. And I'm not quite sure I'll be able to match this color, but I'm going to do my best and we'll deal with that once we get to that point. Now the entire reason for this build has everything to do with this trash compactor. This is the third trash compactor we've had in this house since we've lived here. Our kids simply pull on these doors way too hard and the doors simply fall off. So we want to get rid of it entirely. Now if we take a look at what's going on behind this trash compactor, you can see there's some old tile flooring as well as some cherry on the very side. So I may want to preserve some of that. Another nice thing is there is some electrical in the very back so that we can attach some outlets. Now, although we have cherry on one side of this void, the other side isn't made out of cherry. So I'm going to try to cover this up with some cherry plywood. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to take some measurements of this void and come up with a design this evening. Then I'll regroup tomorrow and show you what I came up with. One of the most humbling things about being on YouTube is watching the progression of your male pattern baldness. So it's been a couple of days and I think we've finally come up with a design. And when I say we, I mean my wife. Frankly, I wanted to incorporate some drawers into this design, but that got X'd. Surprisingly instead, my wife chose a more simple design. And that design is simply a 2-shelf cabinet, complete with a shaker style front. Now since we have 3 boys and about 100 devices, my wife also wants me to incorporate some sort of charging station on the very top. Lastly, I'd like to incorporate some under cabinet lighting into the 2 shelves that will automatically turn on once that door is opened. Now the electrical components that will be incorporated into this design were just purchased on Amazon, and I'll leave some links in case you're interested in those items. Now since we have a variety of different types of devices, I found this outlet that has normal plugins along with USB-A and USB-C ports. I also found these under cabinet lights that attach to the top of the shelves with a simple magnet. These lights are not only rechargeable, but they also have a motion sensor on them so they'll turn on anytime they sense movement. Now one of the first things that we need to do is to create a box that we can build off of. And in my area, it's very difficult to get cherry plywood. But I was able to find 2 project planks left over at a local lumberyard, and that's what we're going to work with. But in order to use this 3/4 inch plywood, I first needed to figure out how big that void is that I needed to fill. So I went back to my kitchen and I got some simple measurements. And this void is about 34 5/8 of an inch tall, 15 inches wide, and about 23 1/4 inches deep. Next, since some of this plywood looked like it could be used for a skateboard ramp, I wanted to make sure that it was actually 3/4 of an inch. And luckily it came in at about 0.72 inches. Knowing the thickness of that plywood, I could dust off my old algebra book and do a little math. This gave me a rough cut list for the 2 sides, the top and the bottom, as well as the back of the cabinet. So I started the slicing and dicing process and I ripped one of the pieces of plywood to 34 5/8, which is the height of the cabinet. And here's a closer look at some of the plywood I'm dealing with. As you can see, there's areas where the veneer is coming off and there's a lot of blemishes. So in order to clean up some of those edges and square them up, I'm going to use my track saw. So I'm just going to cut off a whisker on this board so that I can preserve as much of this plywood as possible. Once we have one edge cleaned up and squared up, it's time to take this plywood over to the table saw. And here I'm just cutting the 2 sides to the depth of the cabinet, which is at 22 1/2. With the 2 side panels made, I can check it off my list and move on to creating the back panel. Once again, I'll take my other piece of skateboard ramp and clean up and square off one edge. Once I have that one side cleaned up, I'll place it up against the fence and rip it to width at 15 inches. After that piece is cut to width, I'll rip it to height at 34 5/8. Now that we have that back panel made, we can check it off our list and now focus on the top and the bottom. I'll first cut the top and the bottom to depth at 22 1/2 inches. After that, it's just a matter of cutting them to width at 13 1/2. With all those pieces cut, we now have our 5 pieces for the frame. So now that I have the carcass roughly cut out, I now want to dry assemble it just so that I can figure out where I need to put my pocket holes. Spoiler alert here, I didn't end up using pocket holes. But if you do use pocket holes on a build like this, it is a good idea to mark out where those pocket holes should go, because it can be very easy when you're dealing with multiple pieces to cut those pocket holes on the wrong side. So I like to flip over my boards and mark out the side and the edge where all those pocket holes will go. Next up, since I haven't attached any of these pieces yet, this is a perfect time to add the shelf pin holes. And I want to add these holes starting from 3 inches from the bottom, going up about 2/3 of the way. And this is my first time using this Goingmake shelf pin jig, and I really was quite pleased with the results. Having the offset pins on the edge as well as the side really makes this process quite easy. Once you have your first hole drilled, you can simply replace the pin and move on down the line. And we're going to repeat this process on both side panels, both on the front and the back of the panel. With the shelf pins drilled out, I'm now going to do some light sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper just to clean up some of those blemishes. Now, being the high quality skateboard ramp that this was, I was really worried about breaking through those veneers, so I just took my time and barely applied any pressure at all. With the sides cleaned up and the shelf pins put in, I now wanted to start thinking about where I'm going to put that electrical box. Now, unfortunately, this box didn't seem to come with a template to help assist with layout, but I did, however, notice that the instructions were right about the same size of the cutout. Not exact, but close. So the first order of business was to mark out the exact center of our side panel at 11 1/4. Then I could take this quote-unquote template and mark out the location for the box. Marking out where the void needs to go, I could then drill out a hole at each corner as a relief for the jigsaw. Then it was just a matter of connecting the 4 dots. Then the true test came to see if my homemade template worked. Happy with the results, it was now time to start doing a dry assembly of the cabinet box. So I just made sure everything was square and flush on the corners. Then I could quickly mark out the approximate center of the plywood on the outside of that corner. Then I could countersink a couple of holes on that line and drive in some screws. And I repeated this process, attaching all 5 pieces of the cabinet frame. And this is the first time I've used the finger measurement for striking all those lines. I saw John Peters do it and I thought it was such a great idea. It's really quite amazing how accurate it is, and it saves a ton of time versus using a pocket rule. I just wish I would have struck all those lines before I added the clamps. Now you may be asking, why am I not adding glue to these joints? Well, it's because I want to make sure that this thing will actually fit. I wanted the fit of this cabinet to be as tight as possible while still being able to fit into that void. So even an 1/8 of an inch difference could make a big difference in the end. So once I had everything dry fitted together, it was now time for the true test. So I went back to the kitchen and anxiously tested the fit of this Carcass. And let me tell you, I was relieved when this slid right in. But I wanted just a little bit more wiggle room, as we're going to have to put a face frame on this. So I decided I wanted to trim off about 1 inch from the front of this cabinet. So I marked all around the cabinet so I'd know where to make those cuts. Then it was time to take this beast back to the shop. Oh, hey, sorry to interrupt this build, but I ask you to do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Also, if you haven't already, check out my new website, www.flynndogwoodwork.com. There you can find fun woodworking accessories like the t-shirts that I wear in my videos, as well as shop updates and ways that you can support the channel. But most importantly, I hope you're having fun watching this video. Now let's get back to the build. Luckily, since I hadn't glued anything, I can easily disassemble this project. After that, I can line up my markings to the saw blade and cut every piece down. With the confidence of now having done the test fit, I can now glue and screw everything together. With the sides and the top and bottom glued up, I just wanted to test for square before I added the back. Pleased with the results, I knew that adding the back panel would be a breeze. But even if it wasn't exactly square, that back panel should have pulled everything together. While the glue on this box dries, I next wanted to grab a couple pieces of cherry so that we could start working on some of the other components. One of the things that gave me the most anxiety about this project was building a shaker door, as I've never built one before. And I wanted this door to precisely match some of the other doors in our kitchen, so I took a few measurements off the other doors to figure out the dimensions of the shaker style door. And the longest component of this door is the height at 29 3/4 of an inch. And because I'm prone to mistakes, I want to take some of the rough cut lumber and cut it a little heavy. Not only do I want to cut down the length of these doors or the stiles a little heavy, but I also want to cut down the floating panel heavy as well. So I'm going to prep some of this rough lumber at 31 inches. After cleaning up one edge, I can cut the pieces down to size. And yes, this miter saw blade was really dull, so I was having a really hard time getting through this lumber and it was leaving a lot of burn marks. I've since replaced this blade and it's amazing how much of a difference a new blade makes. Once the pieces for the stiles and the floating panel were rough cut, I could then move on to the rails. And for the rails, I decided to cut them down to 17 inches. With all my blanks cut, I could then move on to the joiner and mark them up so that I could smooth them out. And I'll just do a face and an edge on each board until I no longer see my markings. After that, we can move over to the planer to finish out the opposite side. And since I want all my stock to be at 3/4 of an inch, this is where that Wixie digital readout really comes in handy. And here you can see how accurate that readout is once it's properly calibrated. With 3 faces prepped, it was time to clean up the last face over at the table saw. Now that all our stock is milled up, you can see how nicely it comes together. And these 3 pieces will be for the floating panel, but they're a little thick, as I'd like this panel to be a 1/2 inch thick with a 1/4 inch tongue. So I'll go back to the planer and just thin these 3 boards out to a 1/2 inch thick. Once I have those 3 boards to a 1/2 inch thick, I can now glue them up into a panel. And since these boards are so thin relative to the width of the panel, I'm going to add a caul. After a little bit of cleanup, I can set them to the side and let that glue cure. Now it's time to make the rails and stiles. And the width of both of these in my kitchen is exactly 3 inches wide. So I'll quickly rip all those pieces down to 3 inches wide. With everything cut to width, I can go back to the drawing board and figure out how long each one of these pieces needs to be. For the stiles, we're looking at 29 3/4 of an inch, while the rails are both 10 inches wide. So I'll mark out all my pieces to size and take them over to the miter saw. And here I'm just cutting both pieces at the same time to maintain consistency. Once everything's cut, I can place them together and realize I made my first mistake. I didn't take into account that both rails are going to have a little extra length for the tongues that will fit into the stiles. So I had to mill up a couple of extra pieces with enough length to include the tongue. Now that I have enough pieces milled up to the correct size, it's time to create the grooves in each one of the rails and stiles. And I'm going to do this over at the table saw, so I'll first set my fence to a 1/4 of an inch. With my fence set, I'll now adjust the height of the blade to 3/4 of an inch. Once the blade is set, I'll run each board through on one side and then flip the board around and run it through on the other side. This will ensure that that 3/4 inch groove is exactly in the center of each board. And I'll continue this process making micro adjustments to the fence until I get a perfect 1/4 inch groove in the center of each board. Once those grooves are made, your rails and stiles should look like this. Now it's time to cut the tongues on the rails. To do this, I'm going to place one of my rails right next to my blade. Then I want to lower the blade until the blade is just ever so slightly below the bottom of the groove. Then I'll shave off just a little bit on the end of one of the rails just to test the height. And here you can see we're just a little bit too low, so I'll raise the blade so that we can get right at the center of that board. Once I raise that blade just a hair, I'll make a few more test cuts just to see where we're at. And here you can see we've removed just enough wood to create a perfect tongue. So I'll continue the process of creating tongues on both sides of the rails using the stop block on my miter gauge. And this could be done a lot more efficiently using a dado stack, but since this is my first shaker style door, I wanted to take my time. I do, however, have a flat tooth blade in the saw, so all these cuts are pretty clean. After all those cuts, you can see how nicely these 2 pieces come together with just enough room for a little glue. And it was quite satisfying to see all these pieces come together so nicely after all that cutting. Since my floating panel wasn't quite dry yet, I decided to move on to another part of the project and begin working on the shelves for the cabinet. And to create these shelves, I decided to use some referential measurements, taking a measurement on the inside of the cabinet. And luckily I had just enough plywood left over to make both of these shelves, as the interior of this cabinet was just a little bit over 13 3/8. So I ripped down the plywood to 13 5/16, giving me just a little bit of wiggle room. Once I had the width of the shelves cut out, I now measured the interior of the cabinet to get the depth, which at this point was exactly at 20 inches. So I set my fence to 20 inches and cross-cut 2 pieces at 20 inches long. Now in order to give the appearance of a thicker shelf, I'm going to add a 2-inch wide piece of cherry to the very front of the shelf. Not only will this wood give the appearance of a thicker shelf, but it's also going to do a great job of concealing the under cabinet lighting. I also want to cover up the sides and the back of the plywood with some hardwood edge banding as well. By adding the edge banding and accounting for the thickness of the shelf pins, I need to cut each one of these shelves a little bit thinner. So I'll move my table saw fence down to 13 inches and trim down each one of these shelves. With the shelves cut appropriately, I can now begin to work on some edge banding. And to do this, I'm going to be using a tool that I featured a couple of weeks ago, the Goingmake Thin Rip Jig. And I've set this jig to about 1/4 of an inch, so I'll slice and dice some of the cherry scrap that I have layering around to 1/4 of an inch thick. Now I'm beginning to think I need a new table saw blade as well. As you can obviously see, I've got lots of burn marks on this cherry. But I can quickly and easily deal with that over at the drum sander. And I'll run these through on both sides just to make sure they're as flat as they can be. With the edge banding cleaned up, it's now time to cut it to size. So I'll measure the banding to the edge of the shelf, mark it off, and cut it over at the miter saw. After that, I can add the banding to the shelves with a little bit of wood glue and some fancy pants bandy clamps. And unfortunately, I've only got 5 of these bandy clamps, so I'm going to have to add some normal clamps as well. While I let that edge banding dry, I'll now return to that floating panel for the door. After I take it out of clamps, I'm quite impressed at how flat that panel is. I'll clean up any remaining glue squeeze out or imperfections with the orbital sander. Now it's time to take some referential measurements to figure out how wide and long that floating panel needs to be. To do that, I need to incorporate the length as well as the width of each one of those tongues on the rails. And after taking all those measurements, I get the dimensions of 25.5 inches long by 11 3/8 of an inch wide. I'll first square up one end of the panel using my crosscut sled. Then using that cleaned up edge, I can now cut the panel to length as well as to width. After cutting to size, it appears that it should fit quite well. But I did run into a snafu, as my largest rabbiting bit for my router table was only a 1/2 inch wide. And in my calculations, I incorporated a 3/4 inch tongue. So I'll trim off about 1/2 of an inch on one side, and this should give us the correct size for the panel. Then we can go over to the router table and cut that 1/2 inch rabbet around the entire edge of the panel. After that, fingers crossed, and hopefully everything can be glued together. And for this glue up, I'm only adding glue to the tongues as well as the cheeks on each one of those rails. And with a little bit of persuasion, I was able to get the entire door assembled without adding any glue to the floating panel. So I'll set that door to the side and let that glue cure. While that glue dries, I'm going to revert back to the shelves. With that edge banding dry, we can now work on adding that false front. I'll simply take that 2-inch wood and strike a line where that front needs to be cut. Then it's just a matter of cutting it down to size at the miter saw and gluing it to the front. And I'll repeat this exact same process for both shelves. Once again, we'll set those shelves to the side and let that false front dry. Now it's time to figure out how to cover up that plywood on the front of the cabinet. And for this process, I would normally just add a face frame. But since there's already a face frame on the kitchen cabinets, I need to take a little bit different approach. So what I'm going to do here is almost create a face frame edge banding. And this will kind of be like a very thin face frame at only 1.5 inches. So the first order of duty is to rip a bunch of pieces at 1.5 inches wide. Once we have those pieces cut to width, we'll cut them down to size based on the dimensions of the exposed plywood. And in order to attach the horizontal and vertical pieces of this face frame, I'm going to use pocket holes. So I'll cut pocket holes on both sides of the horizontal pieces. Then it's just a matter of attaching the horizontal pieces to the vertical pieces using wood glue and pocket hole screws. And I've found that these MFT style clamps do a great job of holding the joints together when you drive in your screws. Once we have everything attached together, you can see how this face frame will cover up all that exposed plywood. Now it's time to move back to that door. For this door, I want to add some European style soft close hinges. And once again, I'm going to use a tool that I recently featured on a video, the Goingmake Concealed Hinge Jig. By attaching this jig to the door and setting the appropriate offset, this jig makes it really easy to install these hinges. By attaching a forcer bit with a depth collar to your drill, you can easily bore out the material for these hinges. Once I have one end done, I'll repeat the process on the other side. After the voids for both hinges have been made, we can now move on to everybody's favorite job, sanding. And for this project, I went from 80 to 220 going through all the grits. Once all the sanding's done, it's time to start finishing. And the finish I'm using for this project is one that I normally don't use that often. And that's good old-fashioned shellac. Now in this project, I learned that it's really important to stir this shellac to make sure all those solids are dissolved. And for my first two coats, I'm actually going to spray it, so I'm going to cut this shellac with a little bit of water. By spraying this shellac, it makes the application process just a little bit quicker and a little bit more evenly coated. But even after spraying, I ended up putting the last couple of coats on with a good old-fashioned brush. After my final application of shellac, I ended up using some 4/0 steel wool and a little bit of paste wax. This smooths out any imperfections in the shellac and gives it a more natural look. It also takes away some of that unnatural shine that you may get from multiple coats of shellac. It also provided a more accurate match to the finish on the kitchen cabinets where it will be installed next to. Once that finish is dried, we can begin to add the hardware to the doors. And for this, I like to use a square just to make sure that the end of the cabinet hardware is completely level. Then I can use a self-centering drill bit to line up those screws. Once that door hardware is installed, it's now time to install the electrical on the side of the cabinet. This is simply held into place with two screws, and we can plug it into that outlet that's in the back of the cabinet. Next, I want to add that under cabinet lighting to the bottom of the shelves. And these lights are attached using magnetic brackets that are attached with self-adhesive tape. Now it's time to go back to the kitchen where I'll attach the doors to the original cabinet face frame. Once the door's installed, you'll notice that when it closes it doesn't sit entirely flush. And that's because the original face frame doesn't support the door. So I'll add some new face frame around the perimeter of the cavity to give support to that door. And since the original face frame is already finished, I'm just going to use some pocket holes. With the face frame extended, you can see how the door sits flush now. Lastly, it's time to install the door hardware. And to do this, I'm using a cabinet hardware jig to place the handle exactly where I want. Once that handle's attached, the cabinet really blends in with the rest of the kitchen. After that, we can place our two shelves and finish this project up. You can see how that under cabinet lighting turns right on when you move your hand right underneath that shelf. When it's dark, however, these lights automatically turn on as soon as the door is opened. I also really like the incorporated electrical that allows us to get all of our devices off of the kitchen counter. Not to mention, I really like the soft close feature of the door, and I'm still amazed at how close that color match is without any staining. Well, thanks so much for joining me today on this cherry cabinet build. This was a real challenging project for me, and it incorporated a lot of firsts for me. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and leave a comment. It really does help out this small woodworking channel. Until next time, take care as always.